Topic of our Dhamma talk this evening is going to be the absence of the self, in the Pali scriptural language known as Anatta. And I will try to keep this talk to the main points, and I will try not to make it too long. Now, for a better understanding of Anatta, let us first of all look at our personal experiences of self, or of I, or mine. So when we think of when we think of the body, and then usually we relate to it as this body and mind. Or do we relate to it as my body? And then when hearing some sound, then usually what do you say, Chris?
I hear it.
I hear it, there you go. And when seeing some visible object, then you say what? I see it. And then if you have a particular political view, then Jim, what do you say? Which is very precious to you.
It's my view.
It's my view, there you go. And then when it comes to our profession, let's say we happen to be a bus driver with 20 years of accident-free driving experience, and we're really proud of our profession as a bus driver, then we will feel. How will we feel if someone comes and says, "You are the most lousy bus driver in the entire district"? You will feel as if you were to be the bus driver. Then would you feel pleased about this, Jennifer? No, not. Pardon me?
No.
Not at all. And so if you're being a bus driver with 20 years of experience is important to you, and someone comes and says you're a lousy bus driver, then you will not be delighted about this kind of statement. And why is this?
You're identified with that.
Because you're identified with your profession, being a bus driver. And the same thing then goes for our being a member of a certain country and possessing a certain nationality. So if we happen to have been born into this particular country, then we're most likely proud to be an American. But maybe it will probably depend on which section of society you belong to. And but for the most part, I assume, unknowingly, that certain people will be proud. Now, again, if someone comes and then challenges our nationality and starts saying bad things about it, then we might not like it too much. On the other hand, if someone else comes and says, "Oh, the Americans are really the greatest on the globe, and their achievements can not be, no other country can parallel these achievements in terms of sciences and aeronautics and whatnot, then obviously we feel greatly pleased, and our sense of self then gets a boost. Now, issues certainly concerning the self also concern our possessions. So if we happen to be, let's say, the owner of a larger lot of land or plot of land, and certainly we're going to subdivide it, we're going to build a number of houses, and then someone comes and just walks around, then this may be seen as infringement. This may be seen as trespassing. The reason for this being there's a great sense of possession there. There's a great sense of identification with the plot of land. Now, this issue of the self has been discussed back and forth, what do you think, only for the last 10 years? Obviously not. For many decades, this issue has come up, and certain people have had different opinions about it. And in particular, the discussions have been about whether a self actually exists or not exists. And if the self exists, as most people assume, then what is that self? And with what do we have to identify the self? What is that part within us that, or what is the center with which we can identify the self? Now, usually, when we, maybe to add one or two more points in terms of personal experience, if we happen to be a mother of 2 or 3 children, then this certainly will very much make up our identity. And then we may be proud of being a mother of 2 or 3 children. And certainly if then, owing to some misfortune, let's say owing to a contagious disease, or the mother's 2 or 3 children pass away, then this will be a great blow to the mother, because with that, her being a mother is certainly being in a very direct manner affected, and that all of a sudden she is not a mother anymore. Now, there are different. Some have called certainly the self a principle of thought and certain action, which thinks, which wills and feels, which knows and sees, and also that which appropriates and owns. It is certainly usually perceived as a durable entity, and the permanent, unchanging factor within the concrete certain personality then sometimes has been identified with the intellect, or with certain perception or other things. And this self then oftentimes is certainly conceived or is thought of to be immaterial and eternal. Now, when we look at certainly the Upanishads, namely Hindu text, then we find that the Upanishads contain many descriptions of the so-called Atman, namely the self. And one of the descriptions, one of the qualities that is being attributed to the Atman is that it is free from death. And furthermore, free from sorrow, vishoka in the Sanskrit language, and that it does have real thoughts, satya sankalpa in the Sanskrit. After death, the soul has form because it appears in its own form. That is what the texts say. Now, it is believed to be permanent, unchanging, and certainly even blissful, and certainly autonomous and unaffected by the vicissitudes of change. Now, the Indian belief system, a distinction is being made between the so-called Paramatta, the supreme self, and the personal or individual self, the so-called Jiva Atta. And so that Paramatta is believed to know everything, to be omniscient, Sabbanyu, and certainly to be the one and only one, Eko Ewa, and certainly then also to be devoid of pain and certainly pleasure, Sukha Dukkha Rahito. And this supreme self is certainly thought to create and control the activities of the individual self. And then, as mentioned, it is thought to be permanent. Now, when it comes to the qualities of Jiva Atta, then it certainly is said that it is controlled by the Para-Atma, and so takes the command of the Para-Atma. It too is permanent and certainly eternal, and that and the size of it then depends on the size of the being it lives in. So that Jiva Atta or Atman is certainly believed to be very big in size in the case of an elephant, and certainly in the case of an ant it is supposed to be very small. And now, at the time of the Buddha, already various views were held about the self, and some thinkers thought that the self is infinite, others that it is finite. Some identified it with, as mentioned, intelligence, some with bliss. And some thought that the self is the soul which would exist eternally, whereas an outspoken minority, such as Ajita Kesa Kambali, thought that the self was material and persisted at death. So let us take a closer look at what this Ajita Kesa Kambali believed in. And in the Digha Nikaya, we find there's the Samanyapana Sutta, namely the discourse on the fruit of recluseship, and certainly in that discourse we find a state Ajita Kesa Kambali's certain view described. And so the context is that King Ajatasattu goes and visits various teachers of the time, and then he asks them about the immediate fruits of recluseship. And so they give different answers. Eventually, King Ajatasattu then visits the Blessed One, the Buddha, and puts the same question to him, namely asking, can you point to such a reward visible here now as a fruit of the homeless life? And then the Blessed One asks in return, well, is it that you have asked this question to other teachers? And he does admit this. And so then the Blessed One goes on to ask him, well, would you mind telling me what those other teachers have said? And then the king explains one by one what they said, and his reaction, his opinion about them. And he was not necessarily convinced of all of their opinions. Now, in Digha Nikaya section 55, we find the following. Namely, Ajita Kesa Kambali said, and this is certainly the king, Your Majesty, there is nothing given, bestowed, offered in sacrifice. There's no fruit or result of good or bad deeds. There's not this world or the next. There's no mother or father. There are no spontaneously arisen beings. There are in the world no ascetics or Brahmins who have attained, who have perfectly practiced, who proclaim this world and the next, having realized them by their own super knowledge. This human being is composed of the four great elements, and when one dies, the earth part reverts to earth, the water part to water, the fire part to fire, the air part to air, and the faculties pass away into space. They accompany the dead man with four bearers and the bier as fifth. Their footsteps are heard as far as the cremation ground. And there the bones whiten, the sacrifice ends in ashes. It is the idea of the fool to give this gift. The talk of those who preach a doctrine of survival is vain and false. Fools and wise, at the breaking up of the body, are destroyed and perish. They do not exist after death. So, how would you describe this teacher's teachings?
Materialist.
As materialist, yes. And what else is he saying? Is there an afterlife? Is there a life after death? There's not. And so, to give a gift to someone, is there any benefit to this? No benefit.
It's a nihilist.
It's a nihilistic view, and certainly even an annihilation view. And so, and then the king Ajatasattu then goes on to speak to or remarks to the Buddha, saying, "Thus, Lord, Ajita Kesa Kambali, on being asked about the fruits of the homeless life, explained the doctrine of annihilation to me. I got up and left." So he was not too pleased. Now, there is another there is another materialistic teacher at the time of the Buddha, who was known as Pakuda Kachayana, and he's also mentioned in that same Samanyapana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. And so he proposed human beings to be made up of 7 immutable principles. And please think for yourselves whether you would agree to this or not. And those immutable principles which lead a person to the conclusion that even cutting off someone's head with a sword should not be considered killing, but should be reckoned only as inserting the blade of a sword in the space intervening between these 7 principles. Would you love to be a follower of this teacher? Not really. So this teacher is certainly saying that certainly taking life or taking what is not given, etc., there's no problem there whatsoever. And he was certainly, or he has been characterized as being a holder of an atomic theory. Now, we have still other views around. Namely, the Christian view. Is there any specialist among you? So, what about the self or the soul? What is the soul? The soul is perceived to be permanent or impermanent? Permanent. And so upon the breaking up of the body, it goes either to heaven or into hell. And then that soul is seen as the immaterial essence of an individual's life. And so from a Christian point of view, that self or the soul is seen as something, some core that continues to exist even if our physical body breaks up. And now, views such as killing, there is no offense to killing, obviously does not apply to Christianity. So there's a difference there. Now, in Christianity, would you say that the soul could be identified with intelligence? Would that be correct to say? Not really. Jim?
Yes.
You think so? So
that's the Christian view, isn't it?
It's the same as intelligence.
The soul has intelligence. Is that what you're asking?
Well, the identification, the soul is tantamount to intelligence. Is that the seat of your soul?
I guess the Christian feels that way, don't they?
Any other views? Well, so don't ask me, even though I've grown up into Christianity.
And souls have some mutability in Christianity. You can go to hell, but if you work hard, you can get to purgatory, and if you work hard, you can get to heaven. So their change is possible.
Yes.
In the Christian framework for the soul.
Okay. Now, in terms of a philosopher, European philosopher, with regard to the self, he came up with the following well-known statement, namely cogito ergo sum, which means what? I think, therefore I am. There you go. And so cogito is to think, I think, ergo, therefore, sum, I am. So, René Descartes, who was that philosopher, strongly believed that because there is or he thought that the thinking is the seat of the self, and so as long as we're thinking, a self exists. Now, we could take that particular view and then transpose it, then say, well, I have feelings, I feel, therefore I am. Or I have certain mental factors that are active, and therefore I am. Or we could say, because consciousness is there, because I am conscious of this on, so therefore I am. Now, despite of these many different notions and understandings of the self, the Buddha had or came to quite some different conclusion. And the Buddha deeply penetrated what is actually going on in the body and the mind, and he checked very carefully whether those assumed identifications were such as thinking and self and intelligence and self and perception, etc., whether those really make sense or not. And he found in the end that self does not exist, and there's no reason whatsoever to identify with any of those 5 aggregates. And the Buddha's teachings, to some extent, have similarities with Hindu teachings or Brahmanis or Brahmin teachings. The distinguishing factor, however, is the Buddha's teachings of Anatta, of the absence of a self. So, the teachings of Anatta make the Buddha's teachings unique and different from other religious teachings. Now, the Buddha's way of refuting the idea of a self are based in, or usually come in 4 different ways. The first one is, and you will very much be familiar with this and be able to relate to this, by carefully observing what is actually going on in this body and mind, by observing the rising and falling movement of the abdomen, pains and aches, and various movements of the body, and then various mental activities. Eventually one comes to the conclusion there are just these 5 aggregates, or in more in a somewhat more simplified type manner, they are just materiality and mentality, nama and rupa. Or we can say they're just those elements or the sense spheres, and none of those bodily formations or mental formations, which we can further break down, can be taken as a self. Now, from a meditator's certain perspective, while you are observing the rising and falling movement of the abdomen, then at least at times the impression will be there that there is no self. But at other times the sense of self may be back. And when we take the case of a pain, it's quite obvious. As long as a pain is relatively mild, meditators will oftentimes say that when observing this pain and relating to it, they just saw it as a process, just a pain, and not my pain. But if that pain gets somewhat more intense, then the sense of self comes back in, and one starts relating to the pain again as my pain. Now, the Buddha's second way of refuting the notion of the existence of a self is by way of cause and effect. And from your own meditation practice, you'll be able to relate to this. So you will have seen for yourselves many times that there are basically just cause and effect, certain connections, or many cause and effect, certain connections taking place. So you see some delicious food, and certainly with this, the desire to take more of it arises. Or you're sitting in meditation, you're trying very hard to develop concentration, and suddenly then maybe someone comes into the meditation hall and is making a lot of noise, and with this, irritation arises in the mind. So what we have here is a connection between hearing what is perceived as noise and then the arising of irritation. So basically, or there is certainly the case of seeing some, or just the seeing process. So there's a visible object, and then there are the eyes. When the visible object and the eyes come in contact, seeing consciousness takes place. And when those three come together, namely the visible object plus suddenly the eyes or eye sensitivity and suddenly seeing consciousness, then one speaks of contact. And phassa in the Pali scriptural language. And so, based on the contact, a feeling will arise, vedana, and based on this, then some perception will take place. So, all of this, the seeing process happens quite naturally without any involvement of a self. And so, if earlier on or under normal circumstances we say I see, then this is on a very relative level, on a conventional level. But ultimately speaking, this is not really what is happening. So there's a huge difference between what appears to be the case and what is actually happening on an ultimate level. So, if formations are connected by cause and effect, is there still any room for a self? There's not. So there is just no need for a self. So that was the Buddha's second way of refuting or defeating the notion of a self. Now, in earlier talks, mention was made of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness. And the Buddha asking visitors whether when an object is, whether formations are permanent or impermanent. And the answer to this is obvious, impermanent. The next question was, when objects are impermanent, then are they conducive to happiness or to suffering? The answer to this is suffering. If objects are impermanent and unsatisfactory, then how can there be a self? And the earlier two preclude the existence of a self. So when formations are impermanent and also unsatisfactory, then they cannot be taken to be a self or a soul. Or those sadhanas should not be regarded as, those formations should not be regarded as, this is mine, this I am. Now, the Buddha's fourth way of refuting the notion of a self is as follows, namely, assuming if really a self were to exist, then the self should also be autonomous, should have some power, and then we should be able to say, okay, I do not want to fall sick. And we should also have the power to say, old age is terrible, I don't want to grow old, so no old age for me. And so, Amy, will this work? It will not work. And so, then we should also be in a position to say, okay, death is terrible, I don't want to die, and yet the self does not have the power. So, even though we do not want to fall sick, we will sooner or later fall sick. Even though we may not want to age, we will be aging. And even though we may not want to pass away, yet we will die one day. So then it becomes pretty obvious that the self is just a fiction. Now, the notion of I am is, in the words of the Buddha, just an imagining, manyita in the Pali scriptural language. And as a result of this, one then thinks, I am this, or I shall be, I shall not be, I shall possess material form, I shall be formless, and so on and so forth. Now, there are several so-called latent or dormant tendencies that contribute to this form of imagining as I am. In the case of the unenlightened being, the mental factors that contribute to such a mistaken view are, first of all, ignorance, not knowing the truth, in particular not knowing the Four Noble Truths, then craving, tanha, in the form of attachment, desire, enjoyment, possessiveness, and then pride and conceit, mana, and this means the application of the I concept as the dominant standard of judgment. And Furthermore, view, namely adhering to a distorted opinion as certain truth. Now, these mental factors, if one is not mindful, will become activated and then will contribute to the arising of the notion of I, or the arising of the notions of I am. And as mentioned earlier on, when we take a very careful look at the seeing process, and then we find that just a visible object is there, and then the eyes are there, seeing consciousness are there, and so things are happening in a very functional manner. Now, when we perceive an object through one of the six sense doors, then a certain feeling will be accompanied, or will go along with this, and then, in the absence of mindfulness, craving comes in, based on a perverted certain perception. And again, in the absence of mindfulness, conceit may also come in, and we start to relate to the object in terms of I or mine, or he or she, his or hers. And if the object happens to be another human being, then it might go even a step further, and we might then think of the other person as being superior to ourselves, or equal to ourselves, or inferior to ourselves. And then wrong view that may also come in, and based on wrong perception and wrongful conclusions, we then imagine for that certain object to be real, and we then crave for it and relate to it, or develop pride and conceit with regard to it. When it comes to certain, let's say, property of that belongs, let's say, to the community, and that then we might develop craving for this, even though it's not mine. And a very simple example that comes to mind is that of the meditation cushions here in the hall. And so after a few days of using one particular cushion, which is placed in one particular location, we start, and let's say if the cushion is rather soft and comfortable, we start liking it. And on top of this, then the notion of what comes in? Of my cushion. And so if someone else dares to sit on it, oh my goodness, then all sorts of conflicts might arise. And maybe this particular example shows you quite nicely how ridiculous it actually is what the mind is doing. These cushions belong to the mountain hermitage, and after the retreat, they will be taken back, right? And they're pretty much all the same in the design and comfort. Now, because of these different factors of ignorance, of craving, of pride and conceit, and wrong view, the concept of I am then gets stabilized and will be firmly established in the mind. Now, just briefly to mention, as human beings, even if we don't hold on to any Christian belief or any other religious belief, we may still identify strongly with parts of our being. So if, for instance, we happen to be young and we happen to have an athletic body, then there is a great attachment to the body, and we will relate to it as my body, and we will not relate to it as just body. And then, if we happen to be a person who, for whom feelings are very important, a person who frequently experience or likes to experience pleasant feelings, then such a person will identify with feelings and will say, my feelings. And if someone attacks a feeling, then it is seen as an attack on the person itself. Now, in the same way, as human beings, we tend to identify with our perceptions, we tend to identify with our mental formations, and we even identify with consciousness. And so this then is rather lacks a proper or lacks a proper understanding of reality. And one can say that because of this notion of an I or self, and related to this the notion of mine, so many quarrels in the world take place. So many quarrels, conflicts, and problems and divisions take place, both individually as well as collectively. Now, if we do not have any particular attachment to some piece of property that another person is liking and wants to appropriate, then there's no problem. But if we are greatly attached to it, and it is important to our sense of self, then the quarreling will come in. Now, in this connection, Daniel Goleman, who is a psychologist by profession and also a prolific writer. He's very well known as a writer. In one of his books, and I assume it's the book Social Intelligence, where he speaks of the notion of a self that's and the question, when does it come up for human beings? And he says that based on modern scientific research, the sense of self is not present in newborn babies, and it is not present until the age of about 1.5 years to 2 years. And so up to that particular age, the babies are usually seen as extremely lovable by their parents. And the reason is because they don't have a sense of self. And there's no sense of owning something. However, as soon as that sense of self starts to arise, and there are also other siblings around who are maybe older, then the quarreling starts. What's that?
They're called the terrible twos.
Oh, the terrible. Oh, there's even an expression for that. Oh, the terrible twos. And so this might serve as another reason to show that this notion of a self is just a notion. It's just a concept that does not have any ultimate reality to it. However, as human beings, let's say if we're 30, 40, 50 years old and we do not meditate, we think the self is absolutely real. And don't touch my sense of self. If you touch my sense of self, if you touch my views, my political views or whatever, or my possessions, then there will be trouble. And so basically, because of this because of not properly understanding the nature of the self and realizing that there is no self in the first place, all these many conflicts arise. So if as meditators the situation changes dramatically because gradually we gain understanding into the nature of the self. Obviously, it's not that we see all the time that the self doesn't exist, but at least there will be certain experiences here and there when we notice, okay, the rising and falling movement of the abdomen is happening all by itself, as a number of meditators have reported today and yesterday. And so there's no sense of a self there. It's just happening. When doing the walking meditation, a similar experience may arise. So one does the walking meditation, the lifting is taking place, the forward movement is taking place, the lowering, placing of the foot takes place, and there's no sense of me doing it. And that sense of self is just not in the picture, and it's just happening all by itself. I'm not saying for the entire walking session, but maybe for a minute or two. And the walking is just happening quite automatically. So that might be a very direct experience of Anatta, absence of a self. Your doing is not needed. You're out of the picture. And with that, you will then realize that things are happening quite naturally and quite happily without your trying to control. And the earlier experience, certainly for meditators usually, is that dramatically they're trying to be in control. Trying to be in control of the rising and falling movement of the abdomen. They want to make it, let's say, a little bit faster or a little bit clearer so that they can observe it better. Or if it is too fast, then they want to slow it down. And the usual experience is it doesn't happen according to one's will and wishes, and the result of this is a headache and a certain dissatisfaction and certain suffering. So things don't happen according to our views or our will. But then, when eventually we manage to step back, a step out of the picture, then things happen quite naturally, and there's no, at that point, there's no suffering. Now, also from a practical point of view, before the Dhamma talk, Alan asked me, what's going to be the topic? And I said, Anatta. And then he asked, will there be any practical application? And so I will try to focus on the practical application. Now, See, if you looked through the true nature of the self, and you've seen that ultimately there is no sense of self, then when at times the self it is not that prevalent, then there's no problem. However, if a meditator keeps in the meditation practice, keeps observing one object after another, dissolving. So you're rising and falling movement of the abdomen, dissolve. And then there's a pain there, you observe it carefully, it dissolves. And then let's say there's a mental state of interest, and this too also dissolves. And then in the end, you observe thinking, your thoughts also dissolve. And then in the end, there's not so much left. And at that point, things get a little bit critical. And at that point in the practice, Jackie, what might come up?
What might come up?
Yes. A sense of?
Self? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
A sense of insecurity and fear. But it's the insecurity that tends to arise. So there's a clear sense of insecurity. Where is this heading to? The nothing is there. Everything, everything dissolves, and with that, also the notion of a self dissolves, and then there's not much left. And so a sense of security, there's a sense of insecurity that then arises, and the usual stability that we are used to, also this gets questioned. And what the mind does in a situation like this, it frantically looks for something to hold on to. And it could be the most miserable thought, at least it's something, some object that the mind can hold on to. And that miserable thought will give the mind and give the person a sense of security and stability. So sooner or later in the meditation practice, this might come up. If it comes up, just be ready for it. And don't overact. Don't overact, and just take the sense of insecurity and lack of stability as objects of observation, and I can guarantee you life will go on. Now, the absence of a self, ultimately speaking, actually comes in very handy. If someone comes up to you, and if you happen to be that bus driver that I mentioned at the outset of the talk, so with 20 years of accident-free experience, driving experience. So someone comes up to you, you're the bus driver, and says, you're the most lousy bus driver here in the county. Then, and you happen to be a meditator, and you know about you've seen through the notion of self, then what happens?
It's just an unpleasant sound.
There you go. It's just an unpleasant sound, and you just label it as hearing, and so as it comes, it goes, it just passes through, and there's ultimately speaking no self, so who is there to be hurt? Pardon me?
It might not even be unpleasant.
It might not even be unpleasant. So the next time you are in a quarrel or a debate with another person, and the other person is throwing all sorts of accusations at you, never mind. Just label it as hearing. And don't, you know that ultimately speaking there's no self, and why defend one's own self? And this is another point that we haven't really looked at yet. See, with a sense of self becomes totally unnecessarily a sense of wanting to protect or defend that notion of self, which again is absolutely ridiculous. And so if you see through the nature of the self, then and someone attacks you, why defend the self? If someone takes pleasure in attacking your notion of self, so what? Okay, let him do. I know. And in the end, peace is important. And if among two people, one person is continuously attacking, and one person is wise, okay, then let the wise person give in and just let it be, and not react. So Dhamma practice very much contributes to the arising of wisdom, and with this and contributes to the arising of peace in the community. Now, from a meditation point of view, when we meditate, then ultimately we will understand the following stanza, which is recorded in the Visuddhimagga, namely, mere suffering exists, no sufferer is found. The deeds are, but no doer of the deeds is there. Nibbana is, but not the man or woman that enters it. The path is, but no traveler on it is seen. And this is it for tonight.